Okay, so welcome to this webinar on post-traumatic stress disorder and healing from trauma. My name is Beth, and I run the support groups and the workshops at Women's Trust. So this webinar will last for an hour and a half. We'll have a little break in the middle, and yeah, we'll start now. Okay. So the aims of this webinar to increase our self-understanding of trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder within domestic abuse, and also to understand the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And we're going to start thinking about how we can heal from trauma through increasing self-compassion. Now, in this webinar, I will refer to the work of Ban de Kolk and Gabor Mate, who are both experts on trauma. They are two writers whose work really resonates with me. They talk a lot about the importance of self-compassion in healing. They've written some books, and at the end of this webinar, there is a reading list which references some really good books on trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. Also, for some, I'm not a doctor, I'm a therapist. So for medical definitions, I have used info from mind.org.uk, and that has a lot of just good information about mental health generally. So I just want to reference that as well. Okay, when watching this webinar, please think about self-compassion. If you're watching this because you have experienced domestic abuse, you may become tearful and sad or angry. This is normal. You have suffered, so it is important to try and be kind to yourself. If you need to take a break, that's fine. If you need to turn off, that's fine. If you need to get some tissues or a cup of tea or some fresh air, please look after yourself. It's really important you're comfortable and you feel safe when you watch this. So you are in control, so you can leave and stop whenever you want. And different memories may come up during this webinar, and this might be distressing for you. So please try and be compassionate to yourself while you watch this. And you may be very tired afterwards, which is also very normal. And if you're able to, you may want to rest in a safe and peaceful environment. Now, the contents of this webinar will be looking at the following: some facts about domestic abuse, what is trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, and complex post-traumatic stress disorder, understanding why the trauma from domestic abuse is so serious, what are the symptoms and do I have them, understanding trauma and shame, understanding trauma bonding, the importance of self-compassion when healing from trauma, how can I help myself, which is really important, traumatic growth, what help is available for people with trauma, and at the end, some signposting to organisations that can provide legal and practical support. And also there's the reading list there as well. Okay, a few facts about domestic abuse in the UK. Almost 1 in 3 women aged 16 to 59 will experience domestic abuse in her lifetime. 2 women a week are killed by a current or former partner in England and Wales alone. It's a bit more than that. It's 1 woman every 3 days. In the year ending March 2019, 1.6 million women reported experiencing domestic abuse. And if you think how much goes unreported, and also that statistic was before COVID began, so I imagine it's far, far higher now. 90% of domestic abuse victims are women. The reason I put those in is because I want you to know you're not alone if you're watching this. And also what a serious problem this is, and how many women will have trauma, and how many women, sadly, are not getting the right support for their trauma. And you might well be one of those. So today we're going to be thinking a lot about how we can help ourselves, because sadly there isn't that much help out there for people with trauma. Okay, so what is trauma? Now, a trauma is defined as a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. The origin of the word trauma is the Greek word for wound. And I think that's really important. I want you to think today about the wounds you have. Wounds can be both physical and psychological. And many of you watching who've experienced domestic abuse will have invisible wounds that cause great pain, but no one can see them from the outside. And that is also what makes this trauma so lonely, because people can't see it and they don't know you have it. And that's what makes the suffering from domestic abuse very, very lonely. And women often talk about wearing a mask as well, because they have to survive and get on with their lives. So you can imagine that you have all these invisible wounds that no one can see. And that's a theme we will come back to again in this webinar. Now, when we talk about emotional or psychological trauma, we might mean situations or events we find traumatic. We might be talking about how we're affected by our experiences. Traumatic events can happen at any age and can cause long-lasting harm. Everyone has a different reaction to trauma, and that's really important to remember. People respond very differently. So you might notice any effects quickly or a long time afterwards. And it's really important you don't compare your trauma to other people's or minimize your experiences compared to other people's as well. We all respond very differently to traumatic events. Now, acute trauma mainly results from a single distressing event, such as a rape, a car crash, an assault, or a natural disaster. And the event is extreme enough to threaten the person's emotional or physical security. And I think it's really important to think about when you have experienced a lot of trauma, the world feels insecure and unsafe. Now that's acute trauma. That's when we're talking about more single events. And chronic trauma happens when a person is exposed to multiple long-term and or prolonged distressing traumatic events over an extended period, such as domestic abuse, war, long-term illness, and bullying, etc. Now, I've just read that out, and many of you watching this will have both. You'll have experienced acute trauma, maybe rape, maybe a very frightening attack, an assault, and also you'll have experienced chronic trauma. That attack, that rape would have happened in a prolonged, distressing relationship of traumatic events over an extended period. So women often have a lot of complex trauma going on. And also you might have more than domestic abuse. Because of the domestic abuse, it might have affected your health. You might have long-term health issues. You might have experienced bullying at work or from your neighbours. When you're vulnerable, sometimes other things happen as well. So please, if that relates to you, please think of yourself with compassion. If you've gone through trauma, you've suffered. So throughout this webinar, we're going to keep coming back to self-compassion. Now, this is really important. I think a lot of people, because your relationship, your domestic abuse has just become your normal, it's what you've lived with, a lot of women I work with really minimize their trauma. They really minimize how bad it was. And they compare it to other people and say, it's not as bad as that. You know, I'm not living in a war zone. Well, actually you are. If you're living in domestic abuse, it is a type of private war zone. But also this is really important. Trauma is most severe when the following occur, okay? When it's human caused rather than a natural disaster. And the reason it's more severe then, so if you have a tsunami or an earthquake, obviously that can be horrific and tragic and people can die and terrible things happen, okay? If you survive that, it's terrible, but hopefully you don't lose your faith in humanity. If trauma is human caused, if it's a domestic abuse or a bomb or something done deliberately by another human, you start losing your faith in humanity. And then the world starts feeling really scary. When it's deliberate, it's also more severe rather than random. So if by extreme bad luck, you were caught up in a terrorist attack, it would be terrible and it would be human caused, but you would know it wasn't deliberate at you. You would know that it was just really bad luck. It was just a really bad accident that you were there. When it's deliberate, the trauma is worse because it's targeted cruelty towards you. It's also worse when it's repeated. Domestic abuse, as we know, is not a one-off incident. Domestic abuse is something that happens for months, years, maybe decades. It's also worse, so it's repeated and long-term make it worse, which would mean domestic abuse. And it is also most severe when it's done by someone you are in a relationship with. So someone you loved and trusted. Now that, I imagine for most of you watching, that might be a partner, but it could also be extended family. It could be your parents. And that makes trauma far more severe. The reason is, if you can't trust your partner, if you can't trust your mum or your dad or your siblings, if you can't trust them, then who can you trust? So it makes the world really frightening, and it makes you feel like you can't trust anyone. And that makes you feel very, very alone. And that is what makes the trauma so severe. Also, for many women watching this, you might have experienced traumas in childhood. That's very normal at Women's Trust. And if you've experienced abuse and trauma in your childhood, it also makes trauma in your adult life more severe. Because you have less resilience and you're coming from a less secure foundation, then if you experience trauma again in your life, it really shakes you up. Okay. Now, the reason I put that in is it's true. Okay. I've done a lot of reading about trauma and research, and this is true. And I also want you to really understand that. Please don't minimize what you've gone through. I also want to say that psychological abuse is just as damaging as physical abuse. And if you speak to women who've experienced both, they often say that they find the psychological abuse more damaging because, again, it's these invisible wounds. If you've got wounds on your skin, people believe you. There's evidence. People can see what's happened. If it's psychological wounds, people don't see you. They might not understand them. There might be a lot of shame about talking about it, about trying to explain it. So please don't minimize psychological abuse. It's just as traumatic as physical abuse. Okay. So if you we'll look later at the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and what comes up when you've got trauma. But it's really important that we understand trauma, we understand the severity of it, and we understand it within the context of domestic abuse. That most women I've worked with who've gone through domestic abuse have chronic and acute trauma. And this is why. Okay, it's human caused, it's deliberate, it's repeated, it's long term, it's done by someone you're in a relationship with, someone you loved and trusted, and possibly you've experienced past traumas in your childhood as well, which makes it even more severe. So please, please have some compassion for yourself if you're watching this, because you will fall into these categories. Okay, so now we've looked at trauma. Now we're going to look at what is post-traumatic stress disorder and what causes it. So post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is a mental health problem you may develop after experiencing traumatic events. The condition was first recognized in war veterans. It had different names in the past, such as shell shock, and it used to be only diagnosed in soldiers. But now there's recognition that it can happen to anyone. The situations we find traumatic can vary from person to person. There are many different harmful or life-threatening events that might cause someone to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. For example, being involved in a car crash, being raped or sexually assaulted, being abused, harassed, bullied. This can include racism, sexism, and other types of abuse targeting your identity, being kidnapped, held hostage, or any event in which you fear for your life, experiencing violence, including military combat, a terrorist attack, or any violent assault, or seeing other people hurt or killed, including in your job, which is sometimes called secondary trauma. I will go on to the next page in a minute, but as I go through this, think about your life experiences. You might have also, even within your relationship, experienced racism, sexism. You might have experienced that at work. You might have been bullied at school. Think about, it might be more than just domestic abuse, or within the domestic abuse, there might also be rape or sexually assault. You might have been sexually assaulted. You might have experienced violent assault within the relationship. When we talk about being kidnapped, some women I work with talk about feeling they were held hostage and imprisoned in their home during the domestic abuse. So although this list isn't necessarily just about domestic abuse, you can see how it could refer to domestic abuse as well. Also, seeing other people hurt or killed and secondary trauma, you might think about your childhood. A lot of women I work with witnessed a lot of violence growing up. That is traumatic and it does have an impact. Okay, so continuing, what causes post-traumatic stress disorder? Doing a job where you repeatedly see or hear distressing things, such as the emergency services or armed forces. Surviving a natural disaster, such as flooding, earthquakes, or pandemics, such as the COVID pandemic we're now experiencing. A traumatic childbirth as a mother or partner, witnessing a traumatic birth. Losing someone close to you in particularly upsetting circumstances, being sectioned or getting treatment in a mental health ward, and being diagnosed with a life-threatening condition. Now, all of these can also cause post-traumatic stress disorder. And I just wanted to say that we are experiencing a pandemic, and I think that is heightened trauma for a lot of women I work with. There's more fear, more isolation, more anxiety about the future, less control. The world seems an even less safe place. So again, have compassion for yourself. I think the last year has been particularly hard, and I think it's made women's post-traumatic stress disorder worse. I think it's echoed the sense of lack of autonomy and freedom, and echoed the sense of being controlled by a partner as well. I think there's a sense a lot of women I've worked with have felt very controlled and very trapped and imprisoned. So the pandemic, I think, has made things worse. So please, all of you, have more compassion for yourself as you watch this. And many women I work with who've experienced domestic abuse have also experienced traumatic childbirths. And that might be because you have had a baby within the context of an abusive relationship. And we know that abuse doesn't stop just because you're giving birth or because you're pregnant. And that can really increase trauma as well. And a lot of women I work with have also experienced a lot of grief within their abusive relationship. Someone they loved might have died, but they might not have been able to express their grief because they were imprisoned in an abusive relationship and not allowed to express themselves. So a lot of women I work with also have a lot of grief that they haven't been able to express. And where it says being sectioned or getting treatment in a mental health ward, a lot of women I work with have also maybe attempted suicide or ended up being sectioned or in a mental health ward because of the domestic abuse. And then that in itself can be a very traumatic experience. And as we know, we'll look at this a bit later, but trauma can have a big effect on our physical health. And sadly, that can cause really extreme health conditions as well, which are then also traumatic. So I think it's important to think about domestic abuse in the bigger context as well, and think about your life, because often women I work with have a lot of layers of trauma. It's not just one thing, there's a lot, okay? So please, please, again, we always come back to compassion. Okay. Now, I know I put this in a lot of my webinars, but just to remind us what domestic abuse is, here is the wheel of power and control. I will go through it quite quickly. On the outside is physical and sexual violence. Obviously, there's a lot more you can say about both of those things, but the wheel of power and control is at its heart, showing how the perpetrator uses power and control to control their victim. And in the inside is the way they do this psychologically. So starting in the top right-hand corner, using intimidation, making her afraid by using looks, actions, gestures, smashing things, destroying her property, abusing pets, displaying weapons, using emotional abuse, putting her down, making her feel bad about herself, calling her names, making her think she's crazy, playing mind games, humiliating her, making her feel guilty, using isolation, controlling what she does, who she sees and talks to, what she reads, where she goes, limiting her outside involvement and using jealousy to justify actions, and minimizing, denying and blaming, making light of the abuse and not taking her concerns about it seriously, saying the abuse didn't happen, gaslighting here, shifting responsibility for the abusive behavior and saying she caused it, which is very common, saying it's the woman's fault. Using children, making her feel guilty about the children, using the children to relay messages, using visitation to harass her, threatening to take the children away, using male privilege, treating her like a servant, making all the big decisions, acting like the master of the castle, and being the one to define men and women's roles. Using economic abuse, preventing her from getting or keeping a job, making her ask for money, giving her an allowance, taking her money, not letting her know about or have access to family income, using coercion and threats, making and carrying out threats to do something to hurt her, threatening to leave her, to commit suicide, to report her to the welfare, making her drop charges and making her do illegal things. And also there is spiritual abuse, which isn't there, but which comes out when a woman isn't allowed to practice her spiritual beliefs in her own way, or she's forced to adopt her partner's spiritual beliefs, or he uses spiritual or religious beliefs to justify his or her abuse. Now, I know you might have seen this before, but I wanted to say that if you take one of those things out in isolation, you might think that's nasty, but it's not too awful, okay? It's the pitch of domestic abuse, it's the repeatedness of it, and it's the unrelentingness of it, and it's the duration of it. And I worked with an amazing woman once who gave me permission to quote her, and she said it was death by 1,000 cuts. And that's how I think of domestic abuse. There might be one big wound every now and then, if we talk about psychological wounds that people can't see, but it's also all the little wounds. It's the death by 1,000 cuts. It's the endless chipping away at you, chipping away at your self-confidence, chipping away at your identity, undermining you. And it's the repeatedness of it. I worked with another wonderful woman who also gave me permission to quote her. She said living with her perpetrator was like living with her own personal terrorist. And what she meant by that is her partner knew exactly, he could torture her in a very specific way. He knew all her vulnerabilities, he knew about her background, he knew all her issues, and he could use that to torture her. And to other people, he looked like the perfect man. He was really good at covering it up, and everyone thought he was wonderful, so he did it all privately. And that's the other thing to say about this. It's all done in private, so no one else sees it, and the trauma you're going through does not get recognized or validated by anyone else. And then you start really doubting yourself. But if you think about it like that, you have your own personal terrorist, which is a terrifying thing to think about. And also the death by 1,000 cuts. It's the endless cuts that end up killing your spirit in a way. So again, when I go through that, I know it might bring up memories for you watching this. It might bring up very specific memories of things you've gone through. So please, please think of yourself with love and compassion. You have suffered. If you've experienced the things on the wheel of power and control, someone was trying to control you and take your identity away. So please, please be kind to yourself. Okay, moving on. So what are the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder? Perhaps the most common one that is talked about is flashbacks. This is re-experiencing a traumatic event, such as a battering or a rape, but also things said, gestures, acts of aggression. Flashbacks are commonly triggered by stimuli which in some way link the present with the past. For example, seeing a knife similar to the one which you were threatened, or revisiting a place in which you were emotionally or verbally abused. If you find yourself avoiding certain places, activities, or objects, this could be because they act as a trigger to the abuse. A flashback is not just a memory of an event, but the re-experiencing of it. Your body reacts as though the danger were in the present rather than in the past. And I think that's the really important thing to say about flashbacks. You relive it. It's not just a memory, you're actually reliving it. And so all the feelings of terror and fear come racing back. And that's why they're so, so distressing and make women feel incredibly anxious and distressed and vulnerable because you're reliving it. And that is what's so cruel about post-traumatic stress disorder. It makes it very hard to move on with your life because the past, you're reliving the past in the present. The other thing that comes up a lot is dreams and nightmares and sleep disturbances. These dreams can be in the form of reenacting or changing what happened sometimes. Sometimes things might be worse. Sometimes you might find your power in a dream. Very often the most common dream I hear about in groups are dreams of violation, where someone is trying to break into your house, your room, or your body, your brain. They're often dreams about violation where you can't keep someone out and they're trying to get in some form or other, and they're very disturbing and frightening. I work with a lot of women who will have to check their doors multiple times before they go to sleep. Sleep should be a place of rest and rejuvenation. And it very sadly, when you've got trauma, it can be absolute hell and a place which you dread. If you had abuse happen to you in the night, it can feel unsafe to go to sleep and close your eyes. And so trauma can really rob you of your sleep. And then you're coping with the symptoms of trauma whilst you're absolutely exhausted as well. And that makes it really hard to think clearly and try and work through things in your brain because you're so tired. So please, please, if you have sleep disturbances, think of yourself with compassion. You're probably exhausted. This is normal. This is normal if you've been through trauma. So some women will wake at night in a state of anxiety. They might have night sweats, the night horrors, or suffer from insomnia and not be able to sleep at all. I put there in capital letters sleep paralysis. I always mention this in webinars just in case someone hasn't heard of it. Sleep paralysis is where you feel like you've woken up, but your body is still in a frozen state and you can't move it, but you feel like you're awake and you can look around the room. It's often accompanied by a massive sense of fear because you feel trapped, and also a sense that you might have a presence in the room with you, and there might be a presence even sitting on your chest. That's often what women describe, that there's something heavy on their chest, like a sort of supernatural presence, and it's trying to stop them breathe. And that's really, really frightening. And I work with women who sometimes think that somehow the perpetrator has possessed them or has taken them over. What I want to say is sleep paralysis is completely normal. You're not going mad. You are not being haunted. It is a normal part of post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma. It's something that happens neurologically, which I can't really explain because I'm not a neuroscientist, but your body is sort of in a semi half awake, half asleep state, which produces this very odd feeling of there's a presence in the room with you, but you're not going mad and it's not just you. And when I do these workshops and webinars, there's often a few people who have experienced that feeling. So again, just be really kind to yourself if you've gone through that, because it can be really frightening. The other thing is numbness and emotional blunting. Now, this is an extremely useful survival tool which enabled us to keep going, especially when the abuse is still ongoing. But once the trauma and stress and real danger has passed, it prevents us from dealing with issues and moving on. So you might have a sense of stuckness, a sense of detachment from the world, a flatness, a numbness. And yeah, this numbness has allowed you to survive the abuse. But if you still have it now, you can still have that feeling of you're not really living, you're not really engaged in the joy of life. And that can be a really horrible feeling that makes you feel really separate and different from other people. And often when I say to people in groups, how are you feeling? They say, I don't know. I don't know how I'm feeling. I just feel nothing. And that's because you had to cut off from all your feelings to survive the abuse. Okay. How I see trauma is it freezes. We talk about the responses of fight, flight, or freeze in a traumatic situation. And most women that I work with freeze. Because that's the only sensible thing you could have done in that moment. You couldn't escape and you couldn't fight back because the perpetrator would punish you for that. And so you freeze. And so I often work with a lot of women who have frozen emotionally to survive. And so when I see women crying, I sort of think they're thawing out, and that's a beautiful thing. So if you find yourself crying a lot, there's no shame about that. It means you're allowed to feel again, but it's painful. When you come back to life, it can be very painful. Okay. Acute bursts of fear or panic, often for no apparent reason, and they can be really sabotaging. You might actually be having quite a nice day or be planning to meet a friend, and then you might have a terrible panic attack. Okay. That is a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder. You're not alone. Sometimes, ironically, when we feel safe, our body almost is allowed then to feel the fear that you weren't allowed to feel in the relationship. So it can be often at times when you feel safe that suddenly this sense of panic comes up, and it's really unsettling. A lot of women are also in a permanent state of hyperarousal and have enhanced or startle reaction. So you're in this permanent fight or flight mode. So think about that. Like if you walk down the road and suddenly you hear a bang or a car beeps its horn, do you jump out of your skin? Are you very reactive? You probably have a lot of cortisol sort of coursing around your body still because of the abuse, which makes you very, very reactive. And the world can feel like a really startling, frightening place. Okay, and that's entirely normal. If you think about the wheel of power and control, you had to tread on eggshells the whole time during the relationship. So that's what you were doing, treading on eggshells, living in fear. And that sense of treading on eggshells doesn't just go because you're not in the relationship. It stays around for a long time afterwards. So you're living in a hyper-aroused sort of state. Also, very, very normal. At least 90%, I'd say probably 100% of the women I work with have depression and anxiety and at times suicidal ideation. Okay, these are normal symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Often women will get medication for these. The doctor will focus on these and diagnose you with depression or anxiety and maybe give you medication. But the larger overall diagnosis of PTSD will get missed, which is a real shame. So all these other symptoms women are not getting supported with. The other thing to remember is brain freeze. We talked about your emotions getting frozen. Also, you get brain freeze, where because you're in this fight or flight mode, where you're just surviving, you don't feel grounded, and you can't then focus, read, concentrate, even write. That's hard. You cannot make decisions. You can't remember appointments. I always think it's a miracle that anyone actually turns up to the workshops and webinars I do, because so many, if you've got trauma, it's so hard to remember things. It's so hard to get there on time. So well done for getting here today. Yeah, and there's a lot of shame about this. Women often feel really ashamed. I feel like I'm really stupid. And if you've been told you're stupid by your partner or your abuser, and then you feel stupid because you've got brain freeze, you then think, well, they were right. I am stupid. I am an idiot. I can't remember things. Did it happen? Am I making it up? It really affects your confidence. It makes you feel a lot of shame. It can make you feel really embarrassed if at work you're losing the plot a bit and you can't remember things. Please, please don't feel shame. This is normal. Okay, trauma has a big, big effect on us cognitively. It's a big effect on memory. It does come back. I work with a lot of women who say things like, am I going through early onset dementia because I just can't remember things? And I say, you're not. that is trauma. You're in survival mode. And when you're in survival mode, it's just about functioning. So everything else just falls away. So remembering things that you don't need to survive, you don't need to do them, you'll forget them. So if you relate to any of these things, please, please think about self-compassion. Any one of these symptoms is really hard. To have all the ones on this page makes life really, really hard. It makes life hard and it makes life frightening. And there's more of these symptoms as well. So we'll now look at these. Detachment from other people. And again, this is a really hard one to live with. You may feel different. So you're physically in the same world as others, but actually living in a parallel universe and not part of it. This can make you feel really separate and feel really, really alone. It's why I love doing group work, because I think that that's when people start connecting with other people and they realize they're not alone. It's the sense that maybe you're sort of behind a screen, that you've got a big glass wall around you. So you're in the world, but you're not really connected to anyone. And the shame of domestic abuse also keeps us feeling like that, because we don't talk about it, because maybe shame, or people will ask you questions like, why did you stay? Because they don't understand abuse. And you're just trying to carry on as normal. So you might go to work, do the school run, do all the things you do and not tell anyone about what you're going through. So if you can feel incredibly disconnected from the world, you may feel you're unable to respond normally to others and interact properly. And if you've been told again and again and again that it's your fault, you're the problem, you're mad, you're crazy, you're bad, you've got issues, you're ugly, your confidence has been chipped away at anyway. And then you've got trauma, and it makes it so hard just to interact with other people. Even going to the shop to buy a pint of milk can become terrifying. And so our comfort zone shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. You may avoid people, eye contact, social situations, and you might isolate, because also the world feels safer, because you've learned that people are cruel and they hurt you. And so you might isolate, but then that's a very lonely place to be. And as human beings, we need human connection. So, although we might isolate to keep ourselves safe, that actually then just keeps us more cut off, and enhances that feeling of detachment. It's a very difficult place to be. Unresponsive to surroundings. You may feel like in a trance-like state. We'll look at that a bit later. You might switch off and have to make a concerted effort to concentrate on your surroundings. If you switch off now, that's fine. You can tune in when you're ready. More seriously, you may dissociate. There are several types of dissociation. We're going to be looking at those a bit later on. And you may be totally detached from or unable to react to the outside world. And that's a really frightening place. Something else which is similar, anhedonia. Sorry, I always say this wrong. Anhedonia. This basically is an inability to feel pleasure. That's feeling no joy in the world. You may be able to hear and see things that would usually give you pleasure. You might, might be a beautiful sunny day and you might see children playing, or you might see, the blue sky and flowers and blossom trees and things that usually might lift your heart, but you feel nothing. You feel an emptiness. And that emptiness, that lack of pleasure, that makes women feel very, very depressed. It can make you feel suicidal. What is the point? Life is so devoid of pleasure and meaning. Avoidance of anything that may remind you of the abuse or trigger flashbacks. We talked about having a very small comfort zone. That might mean that you never go on the underground or on buses. It might mean your world becomes very, very small. Lack of trust, I'd also put in here. You stop trusting the world, you stop trusting people. More profoundly, you stop trusting yourself, and the world becomes very, very unsafe. Hypervigilance, that's a bit like having a startled response reaction. When you're hypervigilant, you never feel you can relax. Domestic abuse kills your ability to relax. If you think about the wheel of power and control, you're permanently treading on eggshells. And so you're permanently hypervigilant, on the lookout, you're on the alert. Now, in a war zone, that's probably useful, if you're trying to avoid bombs, yeah? But this hypervigilance lasts long after the relationship might have finished. If you are out of the relationship, it carries on for a long time afterwards. You have all these neural pathways that have become set in a certain way. You're used to catastrophizing and expecting the worst because that's what's happened. So you're permanently on the lookout for disaster, and you can never feel that you relax. And that's such a sad place to be, where you can never feel safe and relaxed. So I'm just going to, in a minute, we're coming to complex post-traumatic stress disorder, but just to say these are symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. The other one I would put in there is maybe sudden outbursts of anger. You might, feel very, very, very flat, but very, very sensitive as well to things that go on around you. And you might have suddenly extreme outbursts of anger. So in a shop, someone might push into you and it might just set you off in some way. And then you feel a lot of shame about that. Why am I responding like this? It can be very, very hard to regulate your emotions. And we're going to look at complex post-traumatic stress disorder because that has a lot more symptoms like that as well. Okay, so we're going to look at that further. And I'd like you, when I've just gone through those, just think about the ones that you have, okay? And think about if you feel like you have post-traumatic stress disorder. If you have, we'll be looking at ways you can help yourself later on in this webinar. Okay. So what is complex post-traumatic stress disorder? This is abbreviated to CPTSD. It's a condition where you experience the same symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, along with some additional symptoms such as these: difficulty controlling your emotions, feeling very angry or distrustful towards the world, constant feelings of emptiness or hopelessness, feeling as if you're permanently damaged or worthless, feeling as if you're completely different to other people, feeling like nobody can understand what happened to you, avoiding friendships and relationships or finding them very difficult, often experiencing dissociative symptoms such as depersonalization or derealization, and physical symptoms such as headaches, dizziness, chest pains, stomach aches. There's a lot more you could say about them, actually. But fibromyalgia comes up a lot. So if any of you have that, you might have complex post-traumatic stress disorder and regular suicidal feelings. Now, obviously, there's a lot of overlap with post-traumatic stress disorder, but the complex post-traumatic stress disorder is when you have these more long-term sort of emotional complications as well. And a lot of women I work with, when they have actually been able to get an assessment for trauma, they often end up with a diagnosis for CPTSD. Okay, so you might have that. Now, you might never get a diagnosis for this, but you can try and think about recognizing whether you have the symptoms yourself. Okay, and that if you do, and you've gone through domestic abuse, it's very likely you've got complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So again, if you have this, it's very stressful and very difficult way to be. Okay, it's entirely normal. It's a normal response. All of these things are a normal response to very painful and cruel situations. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with you for having these. It's entirely normal. It's to be expected. And so you bring understanding, but bring compassion as well. That these symptoms are difficult to live with and you need help and support. Okay, I'm going to look quickly at dissociation because I'm aware there's a lot to do in this webinar, and then we'll take a break. Okay, so what is dissociation? If you dissociate, you may feel disconnected from yourself and the world around you. For example, you may feel detached from your body or feel as though the world around you is unreal. Now, everyone's experience of dissociation is different. It's a way the mind copes with too much stress during a traumatic event. So it's your mind's way of helping you that the event that's taking place is so unbearable that your mind leaves your body. And we'll look more at that. The experiences of dissociation can last for a relatively short time, hours or days, or for much longer, and that could be weeks or months. Now, there's different types of disorders. There's DID, which sometimes comes up at Women's Trust, dissociative identity disorder. It used to be called multiple personality disorder. And if you have this, you will experience severe changes in your identity. Different aspects of your identity may be in control of your behavior and thoughts at different times. This can happen in various ways. Each of your identity states may have different patterns of thinking and relating to the world. Your identity states may come across as different ages and genders. You may feel you have one main part of your identity that feels like you, and some people call this the host identity. And the different parts of your identity may have memories or experiences that conflict with each other, and some people refer to these different parts of your identity as alters or parts. You might not have control over when different parts of your identity take over. You may experience amnesia, which means you don't remember what happens when another part of your identity is in control. Now, this is when I don't see so much of this, but it's when there's often been very, very severe trauma, and often childhood trauma as well. And it's often related to very, very severe abuse. Ones that I see more of are derealization. You might feel as though the world around you is unreal. You might see objects changing in shape, size, or color. You might see the world as lifeless or foggy. You might feel as if other people are robots, even though you know they are not. You just might feel this sense of disconnection from other people. Now, that might last for minutes or hours or longer. Depersonalization. You might feel as though you're watching yourself in a film or looking at yourself from the outside. You might feel as if you're just observing your emotions. You might feel disconnected from parts of your body or your emotions. You might feel as if you're floating away. You might feel unsure of the boundaries between yourself and other people. Identity confusion and dissociative amnesia. With identity confusion, you might find it very difficult to define what kind of person you are. And you might feel as though there are different people inside you and you don't have sort of one core of yourself. Dissociative amnesia, you might be unable to remember important information about who you are, your life history, or specific events. That's very common with post-traumatic stress disorder. Often women have big blanks, and I sort of feel in that case, like sometimes in therapy, I feel like we're trying to do a jigsaw puzzle, and we're laying out all the bits, and then there's these maybe like a few bits that are missing. And that can be really upsetting. So trying to get a complete picture of your life, and you can't find those missing bits. Sometimes what happens is those bits will suddenly come, maybe months or years after it might come. It tends to be when you feel in some way safe enough that you can recall things. So that can be very painful to recall things. It can happen and actually feel safe enough, but that might take years. It might take years for you psychologically to feel that you're safe enough to remember certain things. Now, with all of these things, you might not have all of them. You might just have a couple of these symptoms. You might have more sort of a general disassociation is what I see, where you might not have a specific disorder, but you have elements of dissociation. A lot of people relate to the fact of feeling as if they're a bit in a trance. They don't feel fully alive and engaged in the world, and they feel a bit separate and if they're outside of life. Now, if you have this, okay, again, please think of yourself with kindness and compassion. These are all complex things to manage. They can make us feel different and separate from the world. And especially if we're going to work and people just don't get it, right? The important thing is that you get it and you understand it's normal. It is possible to heal. I very much believe that from my work. But to heal, we have to sometimes face up to what we've been through and look at our symptoms and see the bigger picture of trauma, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and PTSD, and bring a lot of compassion to ourselves. So we're going to take, let me just, here we go. I'm going to stop the recording now.